Most people just watch and scroll without subscribing. But I know you're not one of them, right? If you enjoy these stories, I'm counting on you. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. When my ex-husband passed away, it wasn't grief that filled the air, it was the thick, suffocating weight of arrogance from my daughter. For years she had made it perfectly clear that in her mind, I was nothing but a footnote in her story, a woman who should have faded quietly into the background after the divorce. The day she called to tell me that her father's estate was valued at $34 million, her voice practically dripped with smug satisfaction. She didn't even pause before saying, "Don't get your hopes up, Mom. You're not in the will. You'll get nothing." I sat in my small kitchen, the same kitchen I had worked so hard to keep after the divorce, staring at the chipped ceramic mug in my hand. The bitter coffee had gone cold, but the sting of her words cut deeper than any drink could soothe. It wasn't about the money. I had built a life for myself without it, one that might not have sparkled with diamonds but was rich in resilience. No, what hurt was hearing the glee in her tone, as if depriving me of even a sliver of her father's fortune was her final victory in some long-imagined war. Her father had always indulged her. From the moment she was old enough to throw a tantrum, she learned that raising her voice and stamping her feet would bring her everything she wanted. While I pushed her to study, to work, to learn humility, he bought her cars, vacations, and later even bailed her out when she racked up debts from a failed boutique business she never took seriously. By the time she was in her 30s, she looked at me the way one might look at a servant who had overstayed her welcome. And when her father's health began to decline, I knew she would circle him like a hawk, ensuring that every last document favored her. So when she sneered through the phone that I would walk away with nothing, I simply said, "We'll see." My calmness seemed to irritate her more than if I had begged. She laughed, the sound high and cruel, before hanging up. The days leading up to the reading of the will were long, filled with memories I had tried to bury. I remembered the years of marriage, the slow unraveling of affection, the way success inflated my husband's ego until there was no room left for me. I remembered how my daughter, barely a teenager at the time, began parroting his dismissive words, mimicking his disdain until it felt like I was living with two critics under one roof. By the time the divorce papers were signed, she had already chosen her side, and I had walked away with nothing but my dignity. I told myself I was only attending the will reading out of curiosity, perhaps to close a chapter that had dragged on too long. But deep down, I admit I wanted to see the look on her face when it all became official. She thought she had one. She thought the fortune was hers alone, as though her father's money would shield her from consequences forever. The morning of the appointment, I dressed in my plain navy dress, the one I wore to church and the occasional dinner with friends. It wasn't flashy, but it was neat, and it reminded me that I had no need to prove anything. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, my daughter was already there, sitting like a queen on a throne she hadn't yet earned. Her designer heels clicked against the polished floor as she crossed her legs, her lips curved into that same smirk she had worn since she was a teenager. "Well," she said loudly enough for the receptionist and anyone else within earshot to hear, "I hope you didn't come expecting a handout. Dad made it very clear who deserved his legacy." I didn't rise to the bait. I simply took a seat, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Her laughter filled the silence, brittle and sharp, but I kept my gaze steady on the door to the lawyer's office. I had lived long enough to know that life has a way of humbling even the most arrogant. When the lawyer finally invited us in, my daughter all but strutted to the chair at the head of the polished mahogany table. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through real estate listings, whispering to herself about penthouses and beachfront villas, as though the fortune was already in her account. I sat opposite her, feeling oddly calm, almost detached, as though I were watching a play unfold rather than participating in it. The lawyer, a composed man with silver hair and an expression that revealed nothing, adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder. He greeted us politely, then cleared his throat. I noticed, just for a moment, the flicker of something behind his eyes, something that almost resembled amusement. "Shall we begin?" he asked. And as he began to read the words my ex-husband had left behind, I realized that my daughter's smug certainty was about to be shattered in a way she could never have imagined. The lawyer's voice carried across the room with a calm authority, and for a moment the sound of his words seemed to steady the air itself, as if the arrogance that had been suffocating the space when my daughter walked in was suddenly being replaced by something far more deliberate. He read slowly, clearly, making sure that there was no possibility of misunderstanding, and each sentence seemed to chip away at the fortress of certainty my daughter had built around herself. At first she didn't notice, too busy nodding smugly as if every word confirmed what she already believed, but then her smile began to falter. My ex-husband had been meticulous, and whatever else could be said about him, his coldness, his ego, his flaws, he had not been careless in his final arrangements. The will began with what my daughter had expected: acknowledgement of the estate's value, the recognition of assets that included properties, investments, accounts, and luxury items she had no doubt already counted as hers. But then came the words that shifted the entire atmosphere. To my daughter, the lawyer read, "I leave the opportunity to inherit the majority of my estate, contingent upon her demonstration of responsibility, humility, and the ability to manage wealth not for her own indulgence but for the benefit of others." The lawyer paused to let the sentence hang in the air. My daughter blinked, then laughed as though it was a joke, a strange little clause meant to sound poetic rather than literal. "Go on," she urged, waving her manicured hand impatiently. "Get to the actual part." But the lawyer wasn't smiling. He adjusted his glasses, glanced briefly at me, and then continued. "The estate shall be overseen by the appointed executor, who will hold the authority to approve or deny the release of funds and assets based on whether the conditions are met. The executor of this will is my former spouse." The silence that followed was absolute. My daughter's laughter cut off like a knife to the throat, her eyes snapping to mine with such sudden fury that I thought for a second she might leap across the table. "What?" she hissed. "That's not possible. You're lying." The lawyer didn't even flinch. "I assure you, miss, I am not lying. Your father left explicit instructions. He entrusted your mother with the power to manage and distribute this estate that only if you prove yourself capable of meeting the standards set out in this document. Until such time, the assets remain under your mother's control." Her face flushed a deep, angry red, and her mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. "That's ridiculous," she finally snapped, slamming her hand on the polished surface of the table. "He told me everything would be mine. He said I wouldn't have to share a cent with anyone, least of all her." The lawyer's lips twitched, and for the first time I saw it clearly, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He gave a quiet, almost imperceptible laugh, not mocking, but something sharper, a laugh that carried with it the weight of irony. "Your father was not a fool," he said gently. "He knew who you were. He knew exactly what would happen if he left you unchecked. That is why he structured this will as he did. He wanted you to grow, not to destroy yourself with excess." I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, though inside my heart beat with a strange rhythm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it was something close, a sense of vindication after decades of being dismissed, belittled, and erased from my own family's narrative. I looked at my daughter, the same girl I had once rocked to sleep, the same girl I had braided hair for and kissed scraped knees for, and I saw not just a spoiled woman but a mirror of her father's worst traits magnified. And now she was being forced to confront a truth she had never considered, that she was not untouchable. "This can't be legal," she spat, her voice trembling now, more from fear than anger. "I'll contest it. I'll go to court. I'll make sure she never sees a dime either." The lawyer closed the folder with a decisive snap. "You are, of course, welcome to contest the will. But I must warn you, your father took every precaution. He even included clauses accounting for legal challenges. Should you attempt to dispute these terms and fail, you risk losing your eligibility entirely. For the first time in years, it was my turn to smile. I didn't gloat or mock her, but I couldn't resist the small curl of satisfaction that touched my lips. My daughter, who had walked into this room certain she held the keys to an empire, was suddenly scrambling, grasping at excuses, her arrogance unraveling strand by strand. She turned to me then, her eyes blazing with fury. "You did this," she accused, pointing her finger as if it were a weapon. "You manipulated him. You poisoned him against me." I raised my eyebrows, unbothered. "I haven't spoken to your father in years beyond necessary arrangements." These are his words, not mine. But she couldn't hear reason. To her, the idea that she had brought this upon herself was unthinkable. She had been raised to believe she was the center of the universe, and now the universe itself was telling her she needed to change. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, his hands folded loosely, and gave that little laugh again, low and deliberate. "It seems, miss, that your father knew what he was doing. And perhaps," he added, glancing at me with the faintest gleam of approval, "he trusted the one person who understood responsibility to carry out his final wishes." My daughter's chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to compose herself, her anger spilling into the air like smoke. She muttered under her breath about injustice, about betrayal, about how this was not what she deserved. But the truth was written clearly in the black ink of the will, and no amount of tantrum could erase it. As we left the office, she stormed ahead of me, her heels clattering against the tile in sharp stabs of sound. I walked behind her slowly, each step feeling strangely lighter than the one before. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the woman pushed aside, dismissed as irrelevant. I was the one holding the cards, and though the weight of responsibility sat on my shoulders, it was a burden I carried with quiet pride. I had not come for revenge, not really. But as the door closed behind us and I caught the lawyer's faint chuckle echoing in my memory, I realized that fate had delivered it anyway. That I and the weeks that followed the reading of the will, I found myself in a position I had never imagined I would hold. Me, the woman who had been dismissed as a nuisance in her own family, was now the executor of an estate worth $34 million. The responsibility was immense, yes, but it was not the responsibility itself that weighed on me. It was the knowledge that my daughter's future now depended on how she chose to conduct herself, and that for the first time in her life she could not manipulate, demand, or throw tantrums to bend the world to her liking. The rules had been laid down, and I was the one expected to enforce them. She called me the very next day, her voice sharp and impatient. "Send me the first distribution," she ordered, as though money were a faucet I could turn on at her command. "I need to pay off a few things, and then I'm putting down a deposit on a new house." I told her calmly that it didn't work that way, that she had to submit a financial plan demonstrating responsibility, that the terms were clear and could not be bent. Her response was pure venom. "This is ridiculous. I'm his only child. I don't need to prove anything to you." But the truth was that she did. Her father's words had tied my hands in such a way that even if I had wanted to indulge her, I could not. And though a part of me pitied her, the little girl who had grown up spoiled beyond recognition, who had never been taught how to stand on her own, I could not deny the strange sense of justice that came with telling her no. She tried, at first, to play the game. She sent me half-baked business proposals, scribbled out in a few pages, outlining grand plans for luxury spas, high-end clothing lines, and travel agencies that sounded more like excuses for vacations than actual businesses. The numbers never added up, the ideas were riddled with flaws, and it was clear she had no intention of following through on any of them. Each time, I rejected her submissions, sending them back with polite notes that they did not meet the standards outlined in the will. Her fury grew with every denial. She called me screaming, accusing me of sabotage, of jealousy, of trying to steal what was rightfully hers. Once, she even showed up at my modest house unannounced, pounding on the door until the neighbors peeked through their curtains. "You're a thief," she shouted when I opened the door. "You're stealing my inheritance. Dad wanted me to have it, not you. You're nothing." You always were nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reminded her, again and again, that these were her father's terms, not mine. If she wanted access to the fortune, she had to prove herself capable. She stormed away that day, tires screeching as she sped down the street, but the image of her fury did not haunt me as it once might have. Instead, it steeled my resolve. While she flailed and fumed, I quietly began to redirect parts of the estate in the way her father had actually intended. The charitable trusts he had established were funded properly, donations were made to causes he had listed in his will, hospitals, schools, shelters for women and children. For years he had talked about giving back but never followed through, too consumed with maintaining his empire. Now, through me, his wealth finally began to serve a purpose beyond vanity. The letters of gratitude began to arrive within months. Schools wrote to thank me for funding new classrooms. A small hospital in need of equipment sent photographs of the lives being saved because of the donations. Women who had escaped violence sent handwritten notes about how the shelter had given them a second chance. Each letter reminded me that the fortune was not meant to rot in the hands of one entitled heir, it was meant to ripple outward, to touch lives that truly needed it. And yet, every step forward in those projects seemed to drive my daughter deeper into desperation. She wasted what little money she still had from her own accounts, throwing parties, buying designer clothes, surrounding herself with people who only cared as long as she was paying. When the funds ran out, so did her friends. Her phone calls shifted from demanding to pleading, her voice trembling now with the panic of someone who had never learned to stand on her own 2 feet. Just give me something, Mom, she begged one evening, her voice raw. Just enough to get back on track. I'll figure it out, I promise. I'll be better. I'll do whatever you say. But I had seen this pattern before. Promises made in desperation, broken the moment comfort returned. I told her gently that if she wanted access, she had to follow the process. She had to prove herself with real effort, with work, with growth. The silence on the other end of the phone told me everything. She wanted the reward without the responsibility, the prize without the effort. Her anger returned soon after, fiercer than before. She threatened lawsuits, she sent me messages filled with venom, and she even posted on social media painting herself as the victim of a cruel and controlling mother who had stolen her inheritance. Some believed her at first, offering sympathy, but as time passed and the truth of her behavior became clear, even those voices fell quiet. The irony was that I didn't need the money for myself. I lived simply, comfortably enough. I wasn't interested in luxury, in status, in proving anything to the world. What I wanted was to honor the conditions left behind, to see the wealth finally serve something meaningful, and perhaps, in some small way, to restore a balance that had been skewed for too long. My daughter had lived her entire life believing she was owed everything. Now, she was learning the hardest lesson of all, that entitlement is a fragile currency, one that collapses the moment reality refuses to play along. For years she had looked at me as though I were beneath her. Now, every rejection, every denied request, every reminder that she was not above accountability was a mirror she could not bear to face. And though I did not set out to hurt her, I could not help but feel the sting of satisfaction every time she realized that I was not the powerless figure she had always imagined. The fallout was inevitable. Her friends abandoned her, her plans fell apart, and her name became less a symbol of wealth and more a warning of arrogance. Meanwhile, I walked through the world with a quiet dignity, knowing that while she floundered, the legacy her father left was finally being used in a way that mattered. And in the quiet of my evenings, when the house was still and the world outside seemed to exhale, I would think back to that day in the lawyer's office, to the moment the words were spoken and the laugh slipped from his lips. My daughter thought I would get nothing, that I would be erased once and for all. But instead, I was the one holding everything, not just the fortune, but the power, the respect, and the vindication of a life lived with integrity.